In the closing months of the Second World War, truth itself began to disappear beneath the smoke of collapsing empires. Entire convoys were erased from naval records, secret directives burned in retreating headquarters, and research laboratories sealed behind false walls. What remained were fragments, intercepted signals, redacted memos, a few names scribbled in margins of files stamped top secret. These are not stories of victory or defeat, but of what the victors chose to forget. Hidden within vaults across Berlin, London, and Washington lies evidence of a war that never officially ended, and of men who refused to let it die. Chapter 1: The Vanished Convoy of Operation Solstice. In the final winter of the Reich, as the Red Army closed its iron fist around East Prussia, the German Navy organized a series of desperate evacuation efforts under Operation Hannibal. Amid those mass civilian movements, one smaller, unlisted convoy was prepared in total secrecy at the port of Gottenhafen, today's Gdynia, Poland. Its designation appeared in a handful of intercepted naval transmissions. Gruppe Solstice. The messages were brief, encoded with the obsolete naval enigma key, Neptune, already abandoned by most Kriegsmarine units. According to post-war debriefs, even officers within Admiral Dönitz's staff had no record of its existence. On the night of February 15, 1945, 3 vessels slipped out under thick Baltic fog. A supply ship named Ostwind, a minesweeper, and an escort trawler. Within 48 hours, they had all vanished. Official Soviet air reconnaissance claimed that the convoy was destroyed by Il-2 bombers north of Hel Peninsula, but no wreckage was logged and no bodies recovered. Curiously, Allied ultra-decrypts captured at Bletchley Park that same week mentioned a high-priority cargo referred to only as NS material. The entry was flagged for transmittal to the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, but then redacted in the final compiled report, file SIOS 43B. When the archive was reopened in the 1970s, that page had been replaced with a sheet marked withdrawn. On national security grounds, divers, working the Bay of Danzig in 1998, unearthed a section of corroded hull consistent with a Kriegsmarine freighter. Inside the twisted remains lay steel crates, welded shut and stenciled with Reichsadler seals. One diver described faint radiation alarms sounding on his suit monitor before the gauges failed. Local authorities cordoned off the area, and within a week, a German federal team arrived claiming to represent an environmental study group from Kiel University. No public report followed. The discovery disappeared into bureaucratic silence. An unclassified US Navy memo dated April 12, 1945, sheds a colder light. It mentions an unaccounted Axis cargo expected to reach northern Norway under Luftwaffe protection, carrying experimental metallurgical samples. The reference number leads to a project once known as Scorpion Sigma, a joint Anglo-American effort to trace suspected Nazi nuclear research. Records show that several crates of non-standard alloy were recovered from a warehouse near Narvik in June 1945. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Commander Walter Bryce, noted in his field log that the material emitted persistent warmth, though the ambient temperature was below freezing. Bryce's report was never filed through the usual chain of command, but hand-carried to London by courier. His personal diary, later auctioned privately in 1963, ended abruptly with the entry: "Shipment diverted. They don't want it catalogued." Eyewitness testimony gathered from Polish dockworkers decades later suggests that Ostwind's manifest included not only cargo but passengers. Scientists from the Reich Research Council, escorted by men wearing SS Obergruppenführer insignia. One survivor, a stevedore named Mariusz Lewandowski, recalled seeing sealed crates with the word Project Thor scrawled in white paint. That codename surfaces nowhere else in German archives, but appears once in a 1947 British scientific intelligence abstract referring to high-energy compression studies undertaken in the Baltic region. The report was signed by Dr. Robert Cockcroft, brother to the British physicist Sir John Cockcroft, a pioneer of nuclear acceleration research. When interviewed before his death, Robert denied any knowledge of the file, claiming it must have been a misattributed reference. By 1952, the US Atomic Energy Commission quietly acknowledged the existence of confiscated Axis materials stored at Oak Ridge under sealed custody. Among them, inventory sheet 7B17 describes unknown ferrous composite, magnetically unstable, origin Gdynia, 1945. The description fits the missing cargo of Ostwind. When Freedom of Information requests were filed in 1999 to access the crate, the Department of Energy responded that no such item existed. Yet, photographic negatives recovered from a defunct British archive show US servicemen posing beside a heavily guarded container stamped with identical serial digits. The sea, however, does not easily keep secrets. In 2012, sonar mapping conducted by a Swedish Baltic Research Consortium detected an object resembling a shipwreck 38 meters long lying in the Gulf of Bothnia. Roughly along Ostwind's projected route, the imaging revealed unnatural geometric anomalies, perfectly circular indentations along the hull, consistent with high heat stress rather than combat damage. Attempts to retrieve samples were halted when the Swedish Coast Guard imposed a no-dive exclusion zone, citing munition risk. Locals whispered that Russian trawlers began circling the area days before the ban, their transponders disabled. Forensic historians who examined declassified Kriegsmarine logs observed one peculiar pattern. The cipher group Solstice appears in several unrelated dispatches, dating from as early as 1943, often connected to rail shipments of heavy industrial equipment. These same shipments were routed to facilities near Thuringia, later known as the site of Germany's most advanced uranium enrichment efforts under the supervision of Kurt Diebner. Cross-referencing with Allied intercepts shows that certain materials from Thuringia were marked for transfer to Baltic evacuation priority in January 1945. The implication is clear. Gruppe Solstice carried more than refugees or treasure. It may have transported the final fragments of an uncompleted weapons project. A single Soviet naval report dated February 17, 1945, mentions a ghost convoy sighted north of Gotland, but dismissed as refugee craft. The entry was later annotated in pencil. Possible deception unit. No follow-up investigation occurred, yet Soviet archives from 1958 reveal that the KGB authorized deep-sea salvage operations in the same region under the designation Task Omega. Those files remain classified even today. One memo from the operation commander, Admiral Oleg Petrov, surfaced during the brief 1990s transparency window. Recovered samples exhibit non-ferrous composition. Transfer to Leningrad Institute of Physics. Confidential. When interviewed for a Swedish television program in 1987, retired Royal Navy cryptographer Alan Thorpe recalled hearing whispers of Solstice during his service at Bletchley. There were certain code names, he said, that came up once and then vanished from the logs. It was as if the message itself had been deleted from existence. His remark was dismissed as anecdotal at the time, but researchers later confirmed that microfilm reels from February 1945 are indeed missing frames precisely where the Solstice intercepts would have been stored. Every nation involved had motive to erase it. For Germany, it was the shame of a final gamble that failed. For the Allies, perhaps, it was the quiet acquisition of something that could not be admitted to the world. The Baltic remains cold, dark, and littered with forgotten hulls, but one in particular refuses to rest. Fishermen still speak of sonar echoes that distort compass readings near a certain coordinate north of Hell. Polish Coast Guards note that radio equipment malfunctions whenever storms pass that area, as if the air itself remembers the frequency of those final transmissions. Whatever Gruppe Solstice carried when it vanished into the fog, uranium ore, experimental alloys, or a prototype that should never have been built, it left behind a silence that resists explanation. The sea keeps its promises better than governments do. Somewhere beneath that grey water lies a chapter of the war that never ended, sealed in steel and secrecy, waiting for a world finally willing to ask the wrong questions. Chapter 2. Shadow Directive. The Zossen Network. In the final days of April 1945, Soviet rifle divisions converged on Zossen, a quiet town 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Beneath its forests lay the underground labyrinth known as Maybach IV and Maybach II, concrete nerve centers of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and the Oberkommando des Heeres. Within those bunkers, for 6 years, the machinery of the German war effort had clicked and whirred. Typewriters, telex lines, Enigma machines, and the echo of orders transmitted to every front. But when the Red Army breached the perimeter on April 26th, they found something else. Silence. Desks overturned, maps shredded, cables cut cleanly as though by surgical blade. One chamber had been burned from within, its ceiling scorched, and the scent of melted insulation heavy in the air. The wall plaque read Fernschreibstelle A13. Soviet engineers assumed sabotage. Yet when they attempted to reconstruct the communications records, they discovered that a complete telex spool, 300 meters of encoded transmission, had been intentionally fused, the ink carbonized beyond legibility. 2 NKVD officers, Major Alexei Markov and Captain Nikolai Sidorov, recorded in their field report that no fire of normal origin could have achieved this. Their superior in Moscow marked the file Operatia Pepel, Operation Ash. What that meant was unclear until 1952, when Western intelligence analysts came across a reference to Directive A13 in debriefings of captured SS officers. According to fragmentary interrogations preserved in British military intelligence report, KW 2219, Directive A13, was a standing order for continuity of governance in foreign territory upon cessation of active combat operations. It was to be executed only upon confirmation that Berlin was no longer under German command authority. The order designated a chain of couriers, assets, and safe houses scattered from Bavaria to Syria. Its objective: safeguard documents, gold, and personnel necessary for the survival of a national corps. The cryptonym for this evacuation effort, Netzwerk Zossen. By May 1945, Allied intelligence had intercepted coded wireless traffic emanating from Madrid, Buenos Aires, and Istanbul, all bearing the same encryption pattern used by the Zossen teleprinter system. Each message began with a prefix, Sie Sud. The origin point remained untraceable. The British initially suspected rogue Abwehr agents. The Americans believed it a Soviet disinformation ploy. But as the Cold War settled into its long stalemate, names once associated with Nazi command began resurfacing in unexpected places. A declassified OSS memorandum from 1947 lists 6 individuals marked as potential assets under Project Paperclip. Among them were 2 field officers of the Wehrmacht Communications Corps, both unremarkable on paper, until analysts realized they had been stationed at Zossen until March 1945. One of them, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Wimmer, later reappeared in Buenos Aires under the alias Carlos Weiss, managing an import company that somehow secured exclusive contracts with several European radio manufacturers. The other, Hauptmann Friedrich Tauer, was documented in Damascus in 1949, serving as an engineering consultant to the Syrian army's newly formed signal division. The encryption devices used by that division bore a suspicious resemblance to late-model Enigma rotors believed destroyed in Berlin. The thread continued into the 1960s, when MI6 analysts detected cipher anomalies in intercepted East German transmissions. The anomalies matched the old Zossen pattern, down to the statistical spacing of null characters. An internal memo dated July 12, 1963, marked for eyes only, summarized the findings. Residual Zossen algorithm detected within Warsaw Pact communication structure, likely embedded at inception stage via external consultancy. Translation: someone from the old German network had been involved in building the East Bloc's own encryption architecture. If true, it meant the remnants of the Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had lived on, hidden within both sides of the new conflict. Fragments of personal testimony give the theory a darker edge. In 1971, a retired Soviet cryptographer named Yuri Kamensev defected to the West, bringing with him a collection of microfilm reels copied from Moscow's military archives. Among them was a partial transcript of NKVD interrogations conducted at Zossen immediately after its capture. One line stood out. Directive A13 authorized simultaneous transmission of 2 streams, one to Berlin, one to Madrid. The content of the second stream was never recorded. That missing transmission may have been the escape signal for the network's surviving members. By the mid-1980s, researchers investigating post-war Nazi diaspora networks, the so-called Kameradenwerke, uncovered multiple shell corporations registered under identical directors across Spain, Chile, and South Africa. One shared corporate signature recurred: a stylized letter Z inside a circle, stamped beside a date. 1945. Financial audits revealed transfers from those firms to offshore accounts in Zurich under the name Verband Z. When investigators attempted to trace ownership, they encountered sealed Swiss banking laws. One archivist, Dieter Koenig, later claimed to have seen a document labeled Nachlass Zossen Protokoll, nannte 7 inside a restricted Bundesnachrichtendienst vault before being dismissed from his post in 1993. Modern German historians still debate the scope of what the Zossen network truly was. Some view it as an informal alliance of surviving officers and bureaucrats, a mutual protection ring that facilitated escape routes to Latin America. Others suspect it was something more structured, a proto-intelligence network designed to preserve Germany's strategic autonomy under any regime, any flag. The British certainly feared the latter. A 1948 communication from Field Marshal Montgomery's intelligence staff to MI5 warned of former Wehrmacht elements coordinating transnationally. Under pretense of reconstruction consultancy, it included a final line, the network that never surrendered. Evidence of continuity appeared again in the digital era. In 2004, a declassified NSA report revealed the rediscovery of an encryption cipher fragment matching the Zossen key pattern within an intercepted Balkan arms trade email. The report dismissed it as coincidence, yet the metadata traced the origin to a computer registered to a private security firm in Buenos Aires. Its founding date, 1949. Its logo, a circle enclosing a single letter, Z. Historians piecing together the story note that even after Zossen fell, portions of its communication infrastructure remained functional for weeks. Underground fiber optic style conduits, unheard of for the time, were later found connecting Maybach-Verfahr to auxiliary tunnels near Wunsdorf. Soviet engineers dismantled the system, puzzled by its sophistication. Decades later, during restoration works, a sealed sub-basement was uncovered beneath the former command complex. Inside were corroded radio sets, rusted uniforms, and a charred steel cabinet containing partially legible blueprints labeled Nachkriegsorganisation, Phase 2. The final line of the surviving document read simply, "The code survives through the code." Whether that line was literal or metaphorical remains uncertain. What is known is that by 1946, several nations suddenly possessed remarkably similar cryptographic technologies, none of which could be traced to an official source. American, Soviet, and British experts each claimed to have reverse-engineered the breakthroughs independently, though timelines suggest otherwise. The pattern points back to Zossen, the one place where, in the chaos of defeat, intelligence officers might have made copies of everything. Today, Zossen is quiet again. Tourists walk through the remnants of Maybach's bunkers, unaware that beneath their feet once pulsed the heartbeat of a state that refused to die. The old teleprinter room, restored by local historians, bears scorch marks still visible under fresh paint. If one listens closely in the cool air of the tunnels, it is said you can hear the faint echo of metal keys striking paper, spelling out the last unsent message of a vanished network. Some believe that message was transmitted, received, and answered, just not by anyone still willing to admit it. Chapter 3. Operation Morning Glass. By 1951, the atomic age was already in motion. The United States had detonated its first hydrogen bomb concept test in the Pacific, and the Soviet Union was closing the gap. Yet somewhere between those official experiments lay an operation that never appeared in the public record. One buried beneath layers of bureaucratic renaming, obfuscation, and total silence. It began in the Nevada desert under the codename Operation Morning Glass, a project born from the shadows of confiscated German research marked Project Morgenglass, seized by US intelligence during the closing weeks of World War II. The documents that inspired it came from a castle laboratory near Salzburg, Schloss Mittersill, where, according to OSS Archive Fragment 17A, German scientists under Dr. Emil Hartmann were conducting optical field resonance experiments. The original papers were discovered by the 3rd Infantry Division in May 1945, inside crates labeled Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt. Instead of routing them through standard intelligence channels, the materials were transferred to a US Army technical intelligence team operating out of Heidelberg, then redirected to Los Alamos under the authority of Colonel Leslie Groves himself. There, they vanished from record. Not even the Manhattan Project's declassification releases in the 1960s mentioned them. Morning Glass officially began in February 1951 at Site 4 of the Nevada Test Range, a remote plateau roughly 50 miles northwest of Indian Springs. The stated purpose was to study radiation pattern reflections under controlled atmospheric conditions. But a recovered project summary labeled WWII Internal Memo 51MG41, described something stranger. Field energy amplification in proximity to reflective lattice geometries. That phrase has puzzled historians for decades. Engineers later equated it with rudimentary electromagnetic pulse experimentation, though the original data suggest a focus on light and magnetism rather than radiation. One handwritten note in the margin reads, "Observe spectral delay. Glass window effect persists after exposure." Witnesses spoke of the first test taking place on June 5, 1951. Instead of a conventional nuclear device, a specialized containment chamber was lowered into a shallow borehole. When activated, cameras placed at half-mile intervals recorded a brief flash, brighter than magnesium but almost silent. Then, for approximately 7 seconds, a translucent dome of light appeared above the desert floor, distorting the horizon like heat shimmer. Technicians reported nausea, vertigo, and sudden radio static on all channels. 3 civilian contractors were said to have approached the test perimeter moments before the anomaly collapsed. They disappeared in the confusion that followed. The AEC filed an internal accident report stating that unauthorized personnel entered restricted zone during electrical test. Their families received compensation settlements sealed under the Atomic Energy Act Section 10C, citing classified exposure event. The men's names, Henry Cole, Thomas Grayson, and Robert Meade, were erased from the site roster, but an unredacted payroll ledger discovered in 1978 at the National Archives still listed their social security numbers beside the phrase, "No further payment required." After the incident, scientists ordered the test footage classified at the highest level. When it was reviewed weeks later, technicians noticed strange interference on the film. The frames between 1.3 and 1.7 seconds after detonation contained a repeating pattern of circular distortions, like ripples on glass, accompanied by faint imprints resembling geometric grids. Analysts dubbed it the residual. The project's chief engineer, Dr. Charles Wainwright, described the effect in his personal notes. "Light seems delayed. Cameras captured images from angles they were not positioned to see." His report never reached Washington. Wainwright resigned in December 1951 and died 2 months later in a car accident outside Las Vegas. Morning Glass was subsequently folded into a larger nuclear testing program under the name Project Plumbob, its original purpose erased. Yet a separate internal file, Defense Code 1794, kept the data classified for decades. Within that file, declassified fragments describe attempts to reproduce the residual optical pattern using high-frequency discharge arrays and polarized glass panels. Nothing matched the original phenomenon. The final entry, dated November 1952, reads, "Replication attempts failed. Original effect not dependent on radiation output. Source energy unknown." It was not until the 1980s that researchers stumbled upon the link to Nazi archives. Among captured German records at the Bundesarchiv Koblenz were references to a project labeled Morgenglas Sonderprogramm, supervised by an engineer named Dr. Helmut Tittel, a former Luftwaffe radar specialist. His 1944 report to the Reich Research Council mentioned photoelectric resonance induced by magnetic compression. The description bears striking resemblance to Wainwright's own phrasing years later. Tittel vanished in 1945. Some claim he was taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip, though no immigration record exists. A surviving letter, allegedly written by Tittel from Munich in early 1946, reads, "They took my work. I told them it must not be repeated in open sky." In 1994, an unmarked reel of film surfaced in a private estate sale in Albuquerque. The footage showed what appeared to be a desert experiment from the early 1950s, equipment matching AEC designs, a control bunker labeled MG4. The reel lasted 21 seconds before melting mid-play, but 3 surviving frames depicted a faint curvature of light above a test rig, resembling an inverted lens. A technician's clipboard visible in the frame read, "Test 2, Morning Glass, 060551. The U.S. Department of Energy quickly seized the footage under the claim of illegally held federal property. To this day, official documentation of Morning Glass remains minimal. Its name appears in only one other declassified record, a 1958 internal memo from Sandia Laboratories referencing light field anomalies observed during early Nevada operations. The memo includes a curious note. German source data predates Nevada site by 5 years. That aligns perfectly with the 1944 Tittel report from Salzburg, which contained experimental coordinates that, when plotted, fall within 20 miles of the Nevada test range's eventual construction area. Either the Germans had coincidentally selected the same geography, or someone had already intended that desert for tests long before it was officially founded. Eyewitness recollections continue to surface. A retired radar technician, interviewed anonymously in 1982, claimed that during a second morning glass test, the horizon split like a mirror. Another scientist, Dr. Sylvia Klein, described electrical failure across all monitoring equipment within a 10-mile radius, followed by whispers in the comstatic, like overlapping echoes of our own, transmissions returning delayed. She was later reassigned to Los Alamos and refused to speak of the incident again. Perhaps the most chilling artifact came from an internal AEC photo log, image number 33MG5, showing 3 men standing at the test site perimeter, faces blurred by motion. None of them match known personnel. On the reverse of the print, someone had scrawled a single line. They arrived after. The handwriting was identified as Wainwright's. The desert keeps its secrets better than any vault. Wind and sand have erased the trenches where the anomaly appeared. Satellite imaging of the coordinates now shows only a faint discoloration, a circular patch where the soil reflects sunlight differently from its surroundings. Radiation surveys reveal nothing abnormal, yet field magnetometers register subtle deviations when crossing the area, as if the ground itself retained a memory of that momentary distortion. If Operation Morning Glass truly replicated something first discovered in wartime Germany, then it may represent a missing link between early radar physics and the birth of directed energy research. But the human cost, the 3 vanished contractors, the sealed compensation claims, the suicides that followed, suggests something more dangerous than science. Those who handled the data often spoke of an afterimage, a lingering impression that haunted vision and thought alike. Some believed the experiment opened a temporary window, not to another world, but to another version of light itself, something the human mind was never meant to see. Whatever the truth, the record closes abruptly after November 1952. The next test in the Nevada schedule simply reads, "Cancelled. Atmospheric instability persists." And then, nothing. Only silence, a smear of light across forgotten film, and a name written in the sand that was never supposed to be remembered. Morning Glass. Chapter 4. The Leningrad Disappearances. The winter of 1944 was meant to mark a liberation. After 872 days, the siege of Leningrad finally broke under the relentless push of the Red Army. The city's population, starved, frozen, and skeletal, emerged from their cellars to a silence more haunting than the bombardment that had defined their existence. Amidst this ruin, Soviet counterintelligence units moved swiftly to reclaim lost ground. What they uncovered in the southern industrial district, inside the ruins of a textile factory along Moskovsky Prospect, defied every assumption of conventional warfare. It was not simply an enemy outpost, it was a ghost within their own lines. When Smersh agents of the Second Baltic Front entered the factory complex on February 10th, they found walls lined with Soviet uniforms neatly hung on hooks. Each tunic bore authentic markings, infantry and NKVD alike, stitched with precise insignia. In one corner stood a field radio still humming faintly, transmitting static across a frequency registered to Soviet command. There were bodies too, 12 in total, sprawled around tables, faces burned beyond recognition, and a 13th corpse sitting upright, untouched, wearing a Red Army coat. Under the coat, an SS dagger and a photograph of the Neva River. None of the men matched Wehrmacht records. Their dog tags were engraved in Cyrillic, their blood types in Latin script. The report filed by Major Anatoly Vetrov labelled the site Commando Rusalka. Smersh interrogations of local witnesses painted an unsettling picture. Residents swore that for months they had seen soldiers, speaking perfect Russian, entering and leaving the factory at night, distributing ration cards and directing civilian evacuations. No one suspected a deception. Vetrov's notes indicate that the unit operated openly as a Soviet relief detachment, coordinating with nearby Red Army positions. Only after the German retreat did discrepancies appear. Identical signatures on conflicting documents, identical faces reported in different sectors on the same day. Vetrov's conclusion was terse. enemy psychological infiltration unit employing mirrored identity constructs. Commando Rusalka was never acknowledged by German High Command, but fragments of captured SS documents found in Königsberg contain cryptic references to Stimme program, voice program, a memo from Reichsführer SS Himmler to SS Obergruppenführer Berger, dated July 1943, mentions experiments in adaptive speech and persona transfer, intended for deep infiltration operations. The corresponding project ledger lists an unnamed linguistics facility near Riga, under the supervision of Dr. Erich Köller, a neurologist who had previously worked at Dachau on acoustic stress resistance trials. He vanished in early 1944, likely transferred eastward. Soviet counterintelligence files later refer to an enemy doctor captured near Pskov, interrogated and subsequently lost in transport. That prisoner's identity was never confirmed. Among the documents recovered from the Leningrad site was a half-burned notebook containing phonetic notations in both Russian and German. One page lists sequences of repeated syllables. Я говорю, я слышу, я не я. I speak, I hear, I am not I. Another section contains diagrams of audio waveforms labeled resonance alignment, suggesting the group's experiments extended beyond mere language mimicry. Laboratory fragments found in the basement revealed remains of magnetic tape reels and crude recording devices, technology far ahead of what was standard for field operations in 1944. Some of the reels bore numbers identical to those later used in Soviet psychological warfare experiments during the early Cold War. The implication was disturbing. Someone continued Rusalka's research after the war. The official Smersh report, stamped and sealed in March 1944, was marked Project 1244 Unsanctioned Mimicry. It described systematic attempts to generate false operational identities through physical and vocal synchronization. In simpler terms, soldiers trained, or conditioned, to become perfect replicas of enemy personnel. Yet one paragraph, later redacted, hinted at something beyond training. Subject B demonstrated rapid morphological adaptation post-stimulus exposure. Duration of coherence, 17 minutes. Scholars still debate whether this referred to psychological breakdown or physiological change, but the language was uncharacteristically clinical for a wartime field report. When the files were transferred to NKVD headquarters for analysis, the transport train derailed outside Covert. The wagon containing the Rusalka documents burned completely. No survivors, no replacements, and yet the story did not end there. In 1958, KGB internal archives referenced residual cases of mimic infiltration discovered in the Baltic military district. One notation reads, 3 agents detained for duplicate credentials, physical resemblance identical to confirmed comrades. Blood analysis shows discordant type markers. The case was closed with the remark, psychological contagion suspected. Decades later, when partial declassification began, the file had been misfiled under medical anomalies, audio neural interference. Modern historians examining the Leningrad case focus on the psychological warfare dimension. It is known that both Axis and Allied forces explored propaganda through controlled vocal transmission, recorded messages simulating known commanders to sow confusion. However, Rusalka's precision surpassed propaganda. One Soviet transcription describes hearing Major Rodin's voice issuing orders on local frequency 2 hours after his confirmed death. Communications officers verified the spectral analysis of the signal. It was Rodin's voice pattern. The origin of the transmission was traced to the ruined textile factory. The site itself became a restricted military zone until 1951. Those who entered reported strange phenomena, echoes where none should exist, static that formed intelligible words, and recurring interference aligning precisely with the frequency of the wartime broadcast. One technical officer, Lieutenant Mikhailov, wrote in his notebook, "We played back the captured recording. It repeated our own orders before we spoke them." He died 6 months later in what was described as a vehicle malfunction. For decades, rumors persisted of an NKVD sub-project codenamed Echo Glass, supposedly derived from the recovered Rusalka reels. The program aimed to study temporal feedback in acoustic intelligence. While most historians dismiss this as conspiracy, one declassified internal memo from 1962 references legacy material from 1244, oral mirror phenomenon. That phrase mirrors a translation from Köller's original wartime report on Resonanzanpassung, resonance adaptation. The terminology continuity is impossible to ignore. The last confirmed artifact linked to Rusalka surfaced in 1986, when renovation crews restoring a bomb shelter near Leningrad unearthed a locked metal cabinet beneath a collapsed wall. Inside were waterlogged documents stamped SS Kommando Rusalka, Versuchsreihe D. The text was nearly illegible, but one phrase stood out in red pencil. Subjekt spricht mit fremdem Akzent, dann mit keinem. Subject speaks with foreign accent, then with none. Alongside the files were 3 phonograph cylinders wrapped in wax paper. Only one was intact. When archivists attempted playback, the cylinder emitted no audible sound until the recording head was disengaged, at which point faint whispering emerged from the static, repeating in Russian, "We are still among you." The find was immediately seized by the Federal Security Service, catalogued under a classification unrelated to historical material. Since then, no mention of the cylinders has appeared in any Russian archive inventory. The Leningrad factory itself has been demolished, replaced by a shopping complex whose foundations rest on the original cellar. Workers occasionally report electrical malfunctions, lights flickering when power lines are stable. One night guard claimed to hear marching footsteps beneath the floor. When security cameras were reviewed, the audio feed captured faint voices counting cadence in German and Russian simultaneously. What began as a wartime deception unit, perhaps a psychological experiment in infiltration, has become one of the most disturbing, unsolved enigmas of the Eastern Front. Whether Kommando Rusalka truly mastered the art of imitation, or simply drove its subjects to madness through forced identity, remains uncertain. But the consistent thread through every surviving report is the same: confusion between the real and the false. "I am not I," the notebook said. In the ruins of Leningrad, perhaps the war did not end with surrender, but with the realization that even memory itself could be weaponized, and no one could tell which voice still belonged to the living. Chapter 5. The Arctic Listening Posts of Project Echo. The Arctic is a place where memory freezes solid, where sound carries farther than sight, and where the sky itself can lie. In 1959, at the edge of that silence, a joint US-British expedition set out to investigate unexplained radio anomalies north of Spitsbergen. The mission was logged under the seemingly innocuous title Geophysical Survey 9AV, but inside NATO archives, it carried another name, Project Echo. The stated objective was to monitor Soviet missile telemetry from Novaya Zemlya, yet declassified scraps suggest a secondary, undisclosed aim: recovery and reactivation of abandoned Axis installations. The operation's lead scientist, Dr. Howard Mercer, was a Cambridge-trained radiophysicist who had previously worked on early warning systems for the Royal Air Force. According to his personal field journal, now in private collection, the expedition began aboard the HMS Protector on July 14, 1959. Upon arrival in Svalbard, the team established base at Ny-Ålesund, but within days, their instruments began detecting persistent low-frequency oscillations at 7.8 Hz, too regular for natural geomagnetic activity. The signal pulsed every 12 minutes, followed by a brief silence and a faint harmonic tone. It appeared to originate from the high Arctic plateau northwest of Nordaustlandet. Mercer's notes describe it as an echo of something old, perhaps human, repeating through the ice. When reconnaissance aircraft overflew the coordinates, they spotted angular shadows half buried in the snow, structures resembling prefabricated bunkers, unmistakably of German wartime design. The decision to investigate was made immediately. What they found would rewrite their mission's purpose entirely. Beneath a meter of compacted ice lay steel-reinforced huts, wiring intact, marked with both swastikas and faded NATO Signal Corps emblems. Inside one shelter, an operational logbook survived the cold. Its pages dated sequentially from 1943 to 1958. The handwriting changed several times, the languages alternating between German and English. The last entry read simply, "Still receiving, awaiting instruction." The find raised impossible questions. How could a Nazi outpost remain active through the Cold War and under 2 different commands? The original records describe a Kriegsmarine meteorological station established in 1943, part of Wettertrupp Haudegen, the last German unit to surrender in the Arctic. Yet the equipment recovered from the Echo site far surpassed weather observation. Magnetometers, reel-to-reel recorders, and prototype signal processors stamped with AEG 1944 Rev 2 Cow. Many devices bore additional engravings dated 1956. The British technicians who dismantled them noted that the frequency readings matched early measurements of the so-called Schumann resonance, natural electromagnetic pulses within the Earth's atmosphere. What made the Arctic readings unique was that they were modulated, as if someone, or something, was intentionally using that global frequency as a communication channel. Mercer's expedition transmitted initial data back to London via encrypted burst transmission. Within hours, they received an unexpected order from the Admiralty: suspend further excavation and await arrival of special observers. A US Air Force C-124 touched down 2 days later, carrying 3 men in civilian attire who refused to identify themselves beyond first initials. They took control of the site and ordered all communication logs sealed under Joint Defense Agreement 414-59. From that moment, Mercer's team became guests in their own camp. The Americans installed portable antenna arrays and began continuous recording of the background resonance. Witnesses described interference so powerful it distorted compass bearings and caused metallic objects to hum faintly even inside tents. The men called their new installation Echo Station 1. They worked without rest, feeding cable deep into an ice shaft leading to a buried bunker the Germans had sealed decades earlier. When engineers finally breached the frozen door, they found another chamber below, its walls coated in aluminum foil and copper wire like an improvised Faraday cage. In its center stood a rusted transmitter, the markings half erased. Project Echo, Versuchsanlage 2. The machine was still warm to the touch. A magnetic reel spun lazily within its housing, recording nothing but static. When one technician stopped it, the static continued in the air, not through speakers, but through the walls themselves. Mercer's diary from August 3, 1959 reads, "Sound moves differently here. We hear it even when equipment is silent. The ice carries it." He reported recurring headaches and insomnia among his staff, coupled with auditory hallucinations, faint voices repeating phrases in German and Norwegian. The Americans insisted these were side effects of geomagnetic resonance exposure, but Soviet intercepts obtained years later suggest they too detected human pattern modulations on the same frequencies, transmitted northward from Svalbard. By early September, 3 of Mercer's men had deserted the camp. Their bodies were never found, though one of their parkas was discovered half a mile away, its inner lining scorched. On September 12th, Mercer recorded his final field entry. The echoes respond now. They repeat our own transmissions, but reversed, as if time itself were bouncing back. The expedition was terminated 2 days later. The HMS Protector departed under radio silence, leaving behind sealed crates marked, "Scientific Waste, Do Not Open." For decades, no one mentioned Project Echo again. Then, in 1981, a declassified Canadian Air Force intelligence bulletin surfaced, describing a radio anomaly north of Spitsbergen interfering with satellite telemetry. The signature frequency, 7.8 Hz, matched the lost Arctic signal. The report concluded that source may be relic of WWII installation, reactivated by natural resonance or unknown equipment. Later analysis revealed the bulletin had been forwarded to NATO under reference code Echo 59 Rev. The same code appears in British Defence Ministry archives, connected to an unrelated 1959 D notice restricting publication of Arctic radio research. Those few who studied the case note eerie coincidences between echoes, timeline and the reappearance of German scientific material in Western laboratories. Specifically, electromagnetic patents filed in the United States during the 1960s describe low-frequency propagation through ionospheric cavities, a concept never publicly researched until after 1959. Some speculate that data recovered from the Arctic site formed the basis of early ELF communication systems for nuclear submarines. Others whisper that it was not mere communication being tested, but contact with whatever had answered the original German signals. In 2007, a Norwegian geophysicist named Dr. Erik Holm led an independent survey of the same region. His team's magnetometers detected weak but structured oscillations, repeating precisely every 12 minutes, modulated with rhythmic intervals matching the original wartime signal pattern. Holm filed his findings with the Norwegian Polar Institute, but before publication, The data were classified under a defense confidentiality clause. He later told a colleague that during the recordings, we heard something underneath the static, like a human breath drawn through metal. He died in 2009 from exposure during an unsanctioned solo return to the site. His recorder was recovered, but the digital file was corrupted, overwritten by a single phrase in German. Wir sind noch hier. We are still here. Satellite images today show faint geometric outlines beneath the ice, consistent with buried structures. Officially, they are dismissed as natural formations, glacial fissures aligned by chance. But on certain nights when the polar aurora intensifies, shortwave operators across Scandinavia still report a peculiar interference, a low hum at the threshold of hearing that pulses exactly 12 minutes apart. Many believe it is just the resonance of the Earth itself. A few, however, claim to have heard whispers within that hum, fragments of an old transmission that never stopped. If true, Project Echo may not have been a listening post at all, but something built to answer a message that the world was never meant to hear, one that has been repeating beneath the Arctic ice for over 70 years, waiting patiently for someone to reply. History does not bury its secrets, it preserves them in silence. The files, the echoes, the signals that never stopped. Each story is a fragment of something larger, a war that continues in the shadows of its aftermath. What began as espionage, as science, as control, became something beyond intent, a distortion of truth itself. Somewhere, in a forgotten archive or an unmarked grave, lies the final connection between these threads. Were they coincidence or components of the same design? The documents remain sealed, but the frequencies still hum, whispering that the war for history is far from over.